The wilderness waits, silent and still, until the moment it strikes. In this video, you'll witness 6 harrowing stories of people who came face to face with some of the most dangerous bears on Earth. From remote mountains to quiet neighborhoods, each encounter unfolds with terrifying speed, and the scars, both physical and emotional, never fade. The hunters move through the towering pines in silence, boots crunching over frostbitten moss as the wind of September 23, 2011, scraped across the ridgelines of Montana's Madison Range. They had camped 2 nights near a shallow creek deep in the backcountry, a place where few dared to tread once the leaves turned gold. Every man in the group had hunted grizzlies or elk before, some for decades. David Kerrigan, 54, had led the expedition, a grizzled outfitter who knew the land better than anyone. His brother Luke, 50, had served 2 tours in Afghanistan. The youngest, Jared Monroe, 28, was a skilled tracker. Then there were the Weller cousins, Mark, Ryan, and Seth, close-knit, strong, and sharp with their rifles. The 6 of them were no amateurs. They carried bolt-action rifles, sidearms, and heavy packs. But even experience and firepower couldn't prepare them for what came next. They had just reached a clearing marked by clawed aspens and scattered bones when the atmosphere shifted. Jared crouched near a tuft of disturbed brush, his voice barely audible as he examined a shredded mule deer carcass. The meat had been mostly stripped, ribs cracked and licked clean. Kerrigan scanned the tree line, heart quickening. The kill was fresh. There was no smell of rot, only copper, musk, and pine. He raised a clenched fist, signaling the group to stay alert, but it was already too late. From the dense cover just 20 yards to their left, the grizzly exploded into view like a freight train. It was enormous, well over 900 pounds, scarred, mud-caked, and raging. Its roar shattered the silence, and before anyone could raise a rifle, it had covered half the distance in a blur of muscle and rage. Mark Weller was the first to fall. The bear barreled into him with terrifying speed, smashing him backward against a log. Its jaws closed around his shoulder and throat, ripping flesh and bone in seconds. Blood sprayed as he screamed and thrashed, but the others barely had time to react. Ryan turned and tried to fire, but the bear was already on him. A massive paw slammed into his side, cracking ribs and launching him several feet into a birch trunk. He slumped without a sound. Jared raised his rifle and fired once, the shot grazing the bear's shoulder, but the creature didn't flinch. It turned on him with pure hatred in its eyes. Jared tried to run, but the bear caught him within seconds. It bit into his lower back and dragged him into the dirt, shaking him violently before slamming a paw down onto his skull. Blood soaked into the moss as the bear moved again, relentless. Kerrigan screamed at Luke and Seth to fan out, but the bear was too fast. It lunged at Luke, knocking him down hard and raking its claws across his chest and arms. He fought back with his sidearm, firing into the bear's torso until the gun clicked empty, but the rounds only seemed to enrage it. The bear sank its teeth into Luke's neck and crushed it with a sickening crack. Kerrigan finally got a clean shot and fired twice into the bear's ribs. It staggered, roared again, and turned toward him. The grizzly was wounded, but was not stopping. Kerrigan backed away, heart racing, shouting for Seth to get to the ridge and radio for help. But Seth wasn't running. He was trying to drag Ryan's body behind a fallen tree, as if shielding it might make a difference. The bear charged again. Kerrigan fired once more but missed. The grizzly collided with him and both went down. Kerrigan fought with every ounce of strength he had left, trying to push the rifle barrel between them, but the beast pinned him and began to tear into his abdomen. Blood gushed from the deep wounds as he screamed beneath its weight. Seth, finally understanding that there was only one choice left, turned and sprinted uphill. His breath caught in his throat, legs burning, eyes wide with horror as he stumbled over roots and rocks. He could still hear the bear's ragged breathing and the final choking gasps of his friends. He grabbed the radio from his vest and screamed into it, trying to raise anyone on the frequency. The only response was static, then a voice, faint, garbled. He screamed their location, his voice cracking as he begged for immediate help. Then he stopped running. He heard it again. Behind him, heavy steps, twigs snapping, low, rhythmic breathing. The grizzly hadn't finished. It had tracked him with unstoppable fury, bleeding, wounded, but alive. Seth turned and raised his rifle, aiming unthinkingly toward the trees. The bear emerged from the shadows, mouth caked in blood, eyes locked on him. Seth fired once and the round struck its chest, but it didn't fall. It lunged again. The last thing Seth saw was the bear's open jaws as it crashed into him, knocking him flat and mauling his neck and chest with relentless power. His scream was cut short. The radio, still clutched in his bloodied hand, crackled weakly before falling silent. It took rescue teams 6 hours to reach the site. When they arrived, what they found left hardened responders shaken. All 6 men were dead, torn apart within a radius of less than 50 yards. Trees were splattered with blood, gear was shredded, rifles were bent or discarded mid-struggle. The ground told the story of a lightning-fast massacre, 2 minutes of total violence that no one had been prepared for. The bear was gone. Tracks led away into the timber, dragging a trail of blood behind them, but it was never found. Officials attributed the attack to a grizzly defending a fresh kill. Some experts believed it had been previously wounded, making it more aggressive. But none had seen this level of brutality. Not like this. Years later, the site remains untouched and unmarked, deep within that remote corner of Montana, where the forest still holds its silence. For many who knew the men, that day became legend. A reminder that in the true wild, even the most experienced hunter can become prey in the blink of an eye. The fog settled thick and low over Kodiak Island, turning the morning coastline into a dim, colorless veil of salt and silence. Jake Morris, 39, stood ankle-deep in the icy surf, casting his line into the slow, churning inlet. He had come alone to this isolated beach after 3 days of hiking through dense spruce forests and climbing slick, moss-covered ridges. An avid outdoorsman and commercial fisherman from Anchorage, Jake had been drawn here by the promise of solitude and trophy salmon that gathered in these remote waters each fall. The beach was narrow and rocky, bordered by driftwood and tangled brush that rose sharply into thick forest. Jake's tent sat 50 yards inland, hidden between 2 gnarled pines, his gear scattered neatly near a fire pit he had dug the night before. He wore a waterproof jacket, chest waders, and carried a flare gun in his vest, more as a precaution than out of fear. He had seen bears before. He respected them. But nothing in his past had prepared him for the sudden eruption of violence that followed. He had just reeled in a small silver salmon when he heard it, one heavy crack from the tree line. Then another. He turned toward the sound, heart rising, squinting into the fog. The brush moved once, then exploded outward with a sound like snapping bones and breaking trees. The bear was enormous, easily over 1,200 pounds, with matted dark fur and a wide, scarred face twisted in fury. It came crashing out of the trees with impossible speed, forelegs pounding the ground as it locked eyes on Jake. There was no bluff, no hesitation. The bear charged. Jake had no time to run, no place to hide. He turned to flee but slipped on a slick stone, crashing hard onto the jagged rocks. His rod flew from his hand as he rolled onto his back, pain radiating from his hip and ribs. He tried to scramble up, but the bear was already on him. The weight hit like a truck. Jake felt the air leave his lungs as the bear knocked him flat and pinned him down. One massive paw slashed through his jacket and tore deep into his left arm, shredding flesh and muscle. The pain lit his world on fire. The second blow hit his ribs and chest, cutting deep and forcing a cry from his throat. He curled instinctively, arms over his head, trying to shield his face as the bear snarled inches from him, breath hot and reeking. Its jaws snapped, teeth clacking near his cheek as it clawed at his shoulder, shaking him with raw violence. Jake tasted blood. His thoughts spiraled into a fog of terror and instinct. He couldn't fight it. He couldn't outrun it. But somewhere beneath the panic, he remembered the flare gun tucked inside his vest. With one shaking hand, he fumbled for the pocket, screaming as the bear's claws raked across his ribs again. Fingers slick with blood, he pulled the flare gun free. He couldn't see, couldn't aim, just pointed it upward from beneath his curled body and pulled the trigger. The flare burst with a deafening hiss, a streak of red light and smoke rocketing skyward with a blinding flash. The bear reared back, eyes wide, startled by the noise and light. Jake fired again, this time closer to the beast's face. Another explosion of light and heat sent sparks into the fog. The bear let out a guttural snarl and stumbled back a step, confused, disoriented, backing toward the tree line with jerky, huffing movements. It paused once, looking back at Jake with a twisted snarl of fury, then turned and vanished into the trees like a ghost. Jake didn't move for nearly a minute, lying in the blood-soaked rocks, blinking at the fading flare smoke. His arm was shredded, his ribs cracked, his chest on fire. The cold crept into his skin, mixing with shock and the copper taste in his mouth. He forced himself to breathe, slow and ragged, then rolled onto his knees and tried to stand. Each step toward camp was a battle. He used the flare gun as a makeshift crutch, limping, hunched, the world spinning around him. Blood dripped from his fingers, from the tear in his side, pooling onto the stones beneath him. The bear could still be out there, he knew that. But if he stayed still, he would bleed out. His only hope was the emergency kit back at the tent and the weak satellite signal his phone sometimes caught from higher ground. When he reached the tent, he collapsed, fingers trembling as he tore open the first aid kit. He wrapped his arm in gauze, stuffed his jacket with whatever fabric he had left, then forced himself to keep moving. He climbed the nearest ridge behind camp, hands dragging along wet moss, boots slipping, blood smearing every rock he touched. At the top, with what little strength he had left, he raised the phone skyward and prayed. The signal flickered, one bar, then none, then again. He hit the emergency beacon app and waited. Minutes passed. Then an automated reply came through. Coordinates received. Jake dropped the phone and lay back, gasping at the cold sky, eyes stinging. The wind picked up, pushing fog across the peaks and through the valley below. Somewhere in that gray wilderness, the bear still moved, massive and unseen, returning to its world of shadows and silence. It took 2 hours for a search and rescue helicopter to arrive. They found him slumped against a rock near his tent, semi-conscious, soaked in blood, barely able to speak. His injuries were severe, multiple lacerations, cracked ribs, and a nearly severed arm. But he survived. The story spread quickly, becoming a cautionary tale passed among fishermen, hikers, and hunters across Alaska. No one could believe he had faced a charging Kodiak alone and lived. Experts believed the bear had been surprised, likely while guarding a nearby food cache. The flares had been his only chance, and by some miracle, they had worked. To this day, Jake has never returned to Kodiak Island. He still fishes, still camps, but never alone, and never without 2 flare guns. He often says the forest didn't try to kill him. It simply reminded him that it could. The mountain trail twisted through towering firs and ancient cedars, the ground still damp from an early morning rain. Sarah Lang, 33, pedaled fast, the tires of her bike humming over the narrow dirt path that cut through a remote stretch of British Columbia's Columbia Valley. She had biked this trail before, an isolated route known for its beauty, elevation gain, and long stretches without human contact. An experienced endurance cyclist and wildlife photographer, Sarah had chosen to ride alone that afternoon, craving the silence, the solitude, and the rhythm of movement under the looming ridgelines. Her gear was strapped tight. A camera rig bounced lightly in her pack. She wore a helmet, gloves, and a windbreaker to guard against the late spring chill. Around her, the forest was calm. Birds above, trickles of meltwater running down shallow ditches. the distant creak of tree limbs shifting in the wind. Everything felt normal, even peaceful. Then the silence broke. She heard it first. A sudden crash from her left, the violent parting of thick undergrowth. Her mind barely registered the sound before a dark mass erupted from the trees. A grizzly bear, massive, charging at full speed, foam at its mouth and claws outstretched, was already closing the distance. Its growl tore through the forest like a shockwave. Sarah had no time to think. She slammed the brakes and turned the handlebars, but the bear collided with her before she could leap clear. The impact launched her from the bike, and she hit the rocky path hard, rolling onto her side as pain shot through her ribs and arms. The bear kept coming. Its weight pressed her into the dirt as claws raked across her back and shoulders. She screamed as her jacket tore open and blood poured from the deep gouges. Her right arm went numb. She curled instinctively, trying to protect her head, but the bear was already biting down on her shoulder, driving its teeth into flesh, shaking her like a rag doll before tossing her aside. The pain was overwhelming, a red-hot burst of agony through every nerve. She tried to move, but the bear swiped again, claws slicing across her hip and back. Her vision blurred. The world tilted and shrank to the sounds of her heartbeat, the snarls above her, and the helpless cry that escaped her throat. Then, voices, distant but rising, panicked and shouting. From up the trail, 2 hikers had heard the noise. They sprinted toward the chaos, shouting at the top of their lungs, waving their arms and grabbing whatever rocks they could find. One hurled a stone that struck the bear in the ribs. The animal turned, snarled, and stood tall, towering over Sarah's crumpled body. Another rock hit its flank. More yelling followed. The bear hesitated. Snarling once more, it dropped to all fours, looked back at Sarah, then turned and loped into the trees, vanishing into the thick undergrowth as quickly as it had come. Sarah didn't move. She lay in the dirt, blood soaking through her clothes, gasping for air, her ribs grinding with each shallow breath. Her shoulder was torn, her arms slashed and swollen. The hikers reached her seconds later, dropping beside her, fumbling with their phones and first aid kits, their hands trembling. She was conscious, but barely. Every movement was agony. She whispered her name, her age, and told them the bear had come without warning. They pressed gauze into her wounds and wrapped her in jackets, speaking fast and shaking, their adrenaline nearly as high as hers. One of them ran down the trail to find a better signal. It took 20 minutes before an emergency call went through. Rescuers arrived by air nearly 2 hours later, landing in a clearing half a kilometer away and moving quickly with stretchers and medical packs. By then, Sarah had gone pale, slipping in and out of awareness. They stabilized her with painkillers and fluids before lifting her into the helicopter. She was flown to a general hospital in Kelowna in critical condition. She survived. Doctors found broken ribs, deep puncture wounds in her shoulder and back, multiple lacerations, and signs of blunt force trauma. Her recovery would take months, surgeries, skin grafts, and endless therapy. But she was alive. She would bike again, though not for some time. The attack left the small community nearby stunned. Sarah had been on a public trail, one that had gained popularity in recent years among hikers and mountain bikers, especially during the spring and summer. Wildlife officials believed the bear had likely been startled, possibly protecting a nearby kill or cubs. They tracked prints along the trail, noted the attack site, and issued immediate warnings. Still, no one could say for certain what had provoked the charge. The incident reignited debates over safety in the backcountry. Some trails were reevaluated for seasonal closures. Rangers began posting more signs, urging hikers and bikers to carry bear spray, make noise, and travel in groups. Sarah's story spread fast, shared across outdoor forums, in news headlines, and among local cycling clubs. She became a symbol of survival, vulnerability, and the swift turn of nature. Months later, when interviewed, Sarah didn't blame the bear. She called it instinct. She had been in its home, unannounced, alone. She still loved the wilderness, still believed in coexisting with wild animals. But she now carried a canister of bear spray, a whistle, and an emergency beacon, even on short trails. Her story, she hoped, would help others come prepared. And for many in British Columbia, the memory of that blood-soaked trail and the screams echoing through the trees served as a chilling reminder of the line between adventure and danger, and how quickly it could be crossed. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees at the edge of the quiet suburban cul-de-sac, casting long shadows over the neatly mowed lawn behind the Parker home. It was a calm spring day, warm, windless, the kind of afternoon that made the backyard feel like a safe, endless world. 7-year-old Liam Parker darted around the yard in a red t-shirt and sneakers, chasing a foam ball across the grass. His parents, Emily and Travis, watched from the porch with quiet smiles, their coffee mugs in hand, as the sound of birdsong rose from the woods behind their fence. Their home sat on the outer edge of the neighborhood, bordering a stretch of dense national forest that stretched for miles. Deer were common visitors. Occasionally, raccoons knocked over trash bins, but they'd never worried. Not really. They had lived here for 6 years without incident, and the fence had always seemed sufficient. But that day, the woods held something else. Unseen, a large black bear moved silently through the tree line. It had been wandering the forest all morning, following a mix of scent trails and instinct. Hungry after a long winter, it had grown increasingly bold, crossing roads at night, raiding bird feeders, sniffing out garbage bins. Earlier that week, a neighbor a few streets over had reported torn trash bags and claw marks on their shed door. But no one thought danger would come in broad daylight. The bear caught the scent of food, meat scraps from last night's cookout, tossed into a bin just beyond the fence, and moved closer. It reached the edge of the yard, pausing beneath the cover of fir trees, eyes fixed on the child in the open grass. Emily stood to refill her coffee. Travis was midway through a sentence when the silence shattered. A loud crash, the sound of something heavy hitting the fence, then a blur of black fur. The bear lunged into the yard without hesitation. Emily dropped her mug as Liam turned, frozen for a split second, his mouth open in confusion. The bear was already on him. It knocked him down with one powerful swipe, jaws snapping around his tiny frame. A scream tore from Emily's throat as the animal clamped its teeth into Liam's side and began dragging him across the yard toward the trees. Travis vaulted from the porch, running full speed, grabbing the nearest thing he could, a metal rake left on the grass. He swung it wildly, slamming it against the bear's side as Emily screamed and tried to grab her son's hand. The bear growled low, dragging Liam faster, its eyes wild, fur bristling. Emily reached for her son's leg, her fingers grazing his sneaker before the bear yanked him free and crossed the fence in a blur of motion. The rake bent in Travis's hands. He screamed, picked up a rock, anything, and threw it into the brush. But the bear disappeared into the shadows of the woods, leaving a trail of crushed grass, blood, and silence behind. They ran after it, breathless, panicked, screaming Liam's name into the trees. 30 yards into the woods, they found him. The bear had dropped him beside a fallen log, already retreating deeper into the forest, disturbed by the shouting. Liam lay on the earth, small and still, his shirt torn and soaked in blood. Emily collapsed beside him, her hands shaking, pressing into his side, begging him to breathe, begging him to speak. Travis dialed emergency services with trembling fingers, unable to form full words as he gave their address, their coordinates, their nightmare. First responders arrived in minutes. Firefighters, medics, sheriff's deputies. They followed the cries through the trees and found the family huddled beside the boy. Paramedics took over immediately, but there was no pulse. The injuries were too severe, too deep. Liam was pronounced dead at the scene. His parents held back as responders covered the small body and began documenting the site. The street was filled with flashing lights, neighbors gathering in stunned silence as word spread. Children were ushered inside. Parents clutched each other, watching from porches and windows. No one had ever imagined something like this could happen here. The bear was tracked later that evening. Wildlife officers followed the prints and identified it. A large male, estimated at over 250 pounds. It had left signs of aggression at multiple sites over the past month, but no one had considered it a serious threat. Traps were set immediately. The area was closed off. Patrols increased, but the damage had been done. The attack sent shockwaves through the town. News crews arrived the next day, and officials held press conferences warning residents to secure garbage, avoid wooded trails, and report sightings immediately. People who had once walked their dogs along the forest edge stopped going outside altogether. The line between wild and human space, once assumed safe, now felt invisible. At Liam's school, a counselor was brought in. His desk sat empty. His classmates drew pictures, left flowers, and asked questions no adult could answer. The Parkers didn't speak to the media. They grieved behind closed doors, their home surrounded by silence, with toys still scattered in the yard, and the grass still stained where the bear had come and gone. In time, the neighborhood installed new fencing, taller and reinforced. Motion sensors were added. Trash bins were replaced with bear-proof containers. Some families moved away. Others stayed, but no longer let their children play outside without supervision. The forest, unchanged, continued to breathe at the edge of it all, silent, still, holding its secrets. The tragedy became a turning point for the region. Wildlife officials launched new campaigns, urging people to recognize that these creatures weren't just distant symbols of wilderness. They were neighbors now. As human development spread and bear populations rebounded, encounters like these were no longer rare anomalies. They were warnings. Warnings that the wild was still out there, and sometimes it walked straight into your backyard. The smell of fresh halibut and smoked salmon filled the air as morning sun filtered over the small harbor of Port Aline, a fishing village tucked into a narrow bay on the southern coast of Kodiak Island. Boats rocked gently at the docks, their nets heavy with the early catch, while vendors in the open market arranged barrels of fish, racks of drying meat, and crates of clams beside folding tables and ice chests. The village was alive with motion. Shouts from fishermen, seagulls circling overhead, the buzz of a town beginning another day shaped by tides and weather. Jake Miller, 46, had worked these docks since he was a teenager. A lifelong resident with a wind-worn face and calloused hands, he knew every family in the village and had long been a calm presence in the often chaotic rhythm of island life. That morning he was unloading silver salmon onto a display table near the center of the square, laughing with an old friend about the day's haul, when the crowd began to shift. The noise started at the edge of the market. Muffled gasps, dropped boxes, people turning quickly to look up the dirt road that wound from the tree line into the village. Jake followed their gaze and felt his body tighten. Out of the trees lumbered a massive Kodiak bear. It was larger than any bear Jake had seen that close. Well over 1,000 pounds. Its fur dark with streaks of mud, ears flattened and nose lifted to the air. The bear paused just beyond the first row of homes, sniffing, blinking in the sunlight, then continued forward with steady steps, drawn by the overwhelming scent of fish. For a few seconds, no one moved. The market froze. Time stretched. Then a vendor screamed. Panic erupted. People bolted in every direction, children grabbed by the arm, crates knocked over, fish dumped onto the ground as footsteps pounded across the square. The bear, startled by the chaos, swung its head toward the sound and began moving faster, shouldering past tables and barrels, knocking over a stack of crab pots with a crash that echoed against the buildings. Jake didn't run. His instincts, sharpened by years on the island, told him that panic would only draw the bear further in. Instead, he stepped around a rack of halibut, keeping his movements slow, raising one arm while calling out in a steady voice, trying to draw the bear's focus away from the fleeing crowd. It worked. The bear turned toward him, jaws slightly parted, teeth glinting. Jake backed up a step, then another, his feet firm, eyes never leaving the bear's. He reached for the air horn hanging from a nearby vendor's table, but the bear lunged before he could lift it. One massive paw swiped out and struck his arm, the force of the blow staggering. Jake stumbled back, pain radiating from his forearm as blood began to drip down into his glove. The claws had sliced clean through his jacket, leaving deep gashes. He clenched his jaw, held his ground, trying not to fall. The bear huffed, reared back slightly and stepped forward again. But it didn't press the attack. It was confused, agitated by the shouting, the smells, the movement. Then the villagers fought back. From behind the fish stalls, several men and women reappeared, armed with bear bangers, air horns, and marine flares. They spread out, surrounding the square at a distance, moving in carefully. One flare fired into the air with a piercing shriek and burst of red light. Another crackled against the pavement, sending up sparks. The bear flinched, turned sharply, and backed away from the noise. More explosions followed, loud, bright, erratic. Someone banged a metal pot against a pipe. Someone else lit a second flare and rolled it toward the bear's feet. The animal reared, swiped at the smoke, then turned toward the path it had entered from and bolted, crashing through crates and buckets as it ran. Within seconds, the bear vanished back into the trees. The square was left in stunned silence, broken only by the fizzing of spent flares and the distant squawk of gulls returning to scavenge what had spilled. People emerged slowly from doorways, peeking from behind buildings, voices rising in anxious waves. Children cried. A few dogs barked from porches. The chaos had passed, but the fear lingered. Jake sat on a plastic chair near the docks, his wounded arm held tight against his chest. Blood stained the front of his jacket, but he was conscious, breathing hard, refusing help until everyone else was accounted for. A local nurse arrived minutes later and bandaged the deep cuts, confirming that none of the tendons had been severed. His bones were intact. He'd been lucky. That night, the village held an emergency meeting. The bear had entered during daylight, wandered straight into the heart of the town, and struck a man in front of dozens of witnesses. Residents demanded answers. Why food waste hadn't been better secured, why no early warnings were in place, and whether more bears were approaching. Wildlife officials flew in the next day to assess the site, set up cameras, and distribute bear deterrents. Experts believed the bear had likely been conditioned by repeated access to food scraps and fish waste near the harbor. Without deterrence, such behavior would only grow bolder. The encounter became a wake-up call. Port Aline was no longer insulated from the growing conflict between wild predators and human activity. The market was restructured with reinforced barriers in place. Fish waste protocols were tightened. Locals began carrying bear spray, even within town limits. And Jake, the man who had stood his ground in front of a charging bear, quietly returned to work a week later, arm wrapped in gauze, as determined as ever. He never called himself brave. He said only that someone had to stand between the bear and the crowd, and he'd happened to be the one in its path. The wind howled across the open tundra, scouring the ice-packed terrain in low, biting gusts. The Arctic sun hung low on the horizon, casting a pale orange glow over the remote Canadian research station, nestled beside a frozen inlet in Nunavut. Thick snowdrifts surrounded the low metal buildings, and visibility shifted minute by minute as wind-driven snow swept across the open plains. Inside the station, heaters buzzed and equipment clicked, but beyond the steel walls, the Arctic remained wild, empty, and indifferent. Emma Novak, 35, a climatologist from Alberta, zipped her insulated suit up to her chin and stepped outside, her boots crunching over the crusted snow. She was checking a series of monitoring devices mounted along a line of tripods 200 meters from the main station. The cold bit instantly, but she was used to it. This was her third season in the field. She moved with practiced focus, her breath misting against her face shield as she ran a diagnostic scanner over the first sensor. There had been no recent signs of bear activity. Still, the team carried radios and flares, and every trip outside the station was logged. Emma worked quickly, glancing over her shoulder now and then, the way all seasoned researchers did when exposed on the ice. The landscape was vast and flat, broken only by small drifts and the occasional outcrop of exposed rock. Then she noticed it. Far across the tundra, a pale shape moved, slow, deliberate, and massive. Her breath caught. She squinted, eyes narrowing against the glare. It was a polar bear. At first it appeared to be just passing, its pace unhurried, its head low as it trudged through the snow. But then it stopped. Its nose lifted to the air. It sniffed, turning toward the station, toward her. Emma didn't move. She knew the protocol: stay still, stay calm, and never run. The bear stared, ears twitching, eyes locked on her from 100 meters away. Then it began walking toward her. The wind dropped for a moment, and the silence became heavy. Emma's radio crackled faintly, a voice from inside the station checking in, but she didn't answer. Her muscles froze as the bear drew closer, moving with the slow, ghostly confidence of a predator that feared nothing in its world. It wasn't running, not yet, but its body was tense, curious, assessing. She took a single step back, the snow crunched beneath her boot. The bear lowered its head and surged forward. It charged without warning, massive paws pounding the ice, jaws parted. Emma dropped the scanner and turned, her heart leaping into her throat. She stumbled backward, boots sliding on the uneven crust. The bear closed the distance in seconds. She didn't scream. Instinct took over, and she dropped to the ground, curling into a tight ball, arms over her head and neck. The bear slammed into her with terrifying force, one paw sweeping across her upper back and knocking her sideways. A white flash of pain shot through her shoulder as the claws tore through her parka. The second swipe sent her sprawling onto her side, the breath driven from her lungs. She lay still, snow filling her hood and collar, the world narrowing to the thunder of the bear's breathing and the burning pain in her arm. Then, shouts, loud, urgent voices rang out from the station. Doors slammed, boots pounded over ice. Her colleagues had seen the charge and were running toward her, armed with flare guns and air horns. The bear lifted its head, ears back, growling low. A flare exploded into the air with a sharp hiss, casting red light across the tundra. Another flare fired low, skimming across the snow and bursting into sparks near the bear's feet. Startled, the polar bear reared back, exhaling sharply. It turned toward the noise, eyes flashing with indecision, then dropped to all fours and retreated at a loping pace, vanishing into the distance with long, graceful strides across the ice. Emma lay unmoving as her colleagues reached her. One knelt beside her, checking for blood, for movement. She opened her eyes, her voice barely a whisper. Pain radiated through her shoulder and upper arm, and her body trembled with shock, but she was alive. They carried her carefully back to the station and stabilized her. Her parka had been ripped open. Claw marks striped her shoulder and back, and her left arm hung uselessly at her side. The medic confirmed a clean break of the humerus and deep bruising around her ribs. There were no puncture wounds, just slashes and the impact of blunt trauma. She had been lucky. If the bear had bitten instead of swiped, it would have been worse. An emergency extraction team was called in. Within hours, a chopper arrived and lifted Emma out, bound for a hospital in Yellowknife. She spent 10 days recovering, then returned south to continue her work remotely. The incident triggered a complete safety overhaul at the station. Protocols were rewritten. Flare guns became mandatory on all solo outings. A new watchtower was built beside the station's edge to monitor for polar bears during daylight hours. A second electric fence was installed around the sensor fields. Emma's encounter became a sobering reminder, not just for her team, but for research stations across the Arctic. Polar bears were powerful, curious, and unpredictable. Climate shifts were driving them closer to human structures, where food was scarce but scent trails were strong. Even the best precautions weren't always enough. Emma later spoke at a scientific conference about her experience. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't make it a tale of survival against the odds. She described it as a reminder of where they worked and the creatures they shared that space with. And in the frozen silence of the Arctic, one step too far could change everything.